She did not choose the name. History gave it to her, carved it into her memory like an epitaph, like a wound that never healed. Bloody Mary. 2 words that erased everything else she was. A daughter, a queen, a woman who had survived things that would have broken most people long before she ever reached the throne. But to understand Mary I of England, you cannot start with the fires. You have to start with the little girl. On February 18th, 1516, a child was born at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich. Her father was Henry VIII, young, golden, magnificent, the most celebrated king in Europe. Her mother was Catherine of Aragon, proud, deeply faithful, descended from the greatest royal house in the world. They named her Mary. Henry had wanted a son. Every king wanted a son. But when he held this small, red-haired daughter in his arms, he told the Spanish ambassador with a smile, "We are both young. If it was a daughter this time, by the grace of God, boys will follow." For a time, everything was perfect. Mary grew up surrounded by love. Her mother Catherine adored her, taught her languages, music, Latin, philosophy. Her father showed her off at court like a prize, called her his pearl, his jewel. Ambassadors came from across Europe to admire the clever little princess who could read Latin at age 4 and play the lute with the delicacy of a trained musician at age 9. She was, by all accounts, a happy child. But happiness in Tudor England was always temporary. Mary was 11 years old when she first noticed that something was wrong. Her father had become obsessed with a woman named Anne Boleyn, dark-eyed, sharp-tongued, ambitious in ways that Tudor women were not supposed to be ambitious. Henry wanted to divorce Catherine and marry Anne. The Pope refused, and so Henry did something that shook all of Europe to its foundations. He broke with Rome, declared himself head of the Church of England, and divorced Catherine anyway. Mary was 17 when her mother was sent away from court. She was not allowed to say goodbye. She was not allowed to visit. Letters between them were intercepted, read, sometimes never delivered. Then came the declaration that destroyed what remained of Mary's world. She was no longer a princess. She was illegitimate, a bastard. Her place in the line of succession was erased, and the woman who had replaced her mother, Anne Boleyn, had given birth to a daughter of her own, Elizabeth, who was now declared the true Princess of England. Mary was forced to serve in the household of her infant half-sister as a lady-in-waiting. Think about what that means. A girl who had been raised as a princess, who had been educated as a future queen, who had been told her whole life that she was special, precious, destined, forced to bow to a baby, forced to call her own father's new wife queen, forced to renounce her mother, her faith, her identity. She refused. For years, Mary refused. She was isolated, threatened, humiliated. Her health deteriorated. She was moved from house to house, always under supervision, always watched. There were moments when those around her genuinely feared she would not survive, not from illness alone, but from despair. And yet she survived, because Mary Tudor was made of something that her enemies consistently underestimated: iron. Then, in the spring of 1536, everything changed. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had destroyed Mary's world, was arrested, tried, and executed on Tower Green. The charges were almost certainly false. But Henry VIII had grown tired of Anne, just as he had grown tired of Catherine. And in Tudor England, when the king grew tired of you, the consequences could be fatal. Anne was gone. Mary might have felt something complicated at the news. Relief, perhaps, a dark satisfaction, but also something sadder, because Anne's fall did not restore what had been lost. Her mother Catherine had died just months earlier, in January of that same terrible year, alone and in poor health, never having seen her daughter again. Mary had no one left. She was 20 years old, officially illegitimate, her mother dead, her enemy executed, her father remarried again, within days of Anne's beheading to a quiet woman named Jane Seymour. Thomas Cromwell, the same man who had orchestrated Anne Boleyn's destruction, now turned his attention to Mary. He needed her to sign a document acknowledging that her parents' marriage had been invalid, that she was indeed illegitimate, and that her father was the supreme head of the Church of England. It was a document that required her to betray everything she believed: her mother's memory, her Catholic faith, her own identity. She held out for weeks. Then, broken and alone, and genuinely fearing for her life, she signed. It was the deepest wound of her life. She never fully recovered from it. Years later, she would weep when she spoke of it, calling it the greatest sin she had ever committed. But she was alive, and alive meant that the story was not over. For the next decade, Mary lived in a kind of suspended existence. She was acknowledged again as part of the royal family, placed back in the line of succession by her father's Third Succession Act of 1544, behind her young half-brother Edward. But she was never truly safe, never truly free. Her faith remained Catholic in a country that was moving rapidly toward Protestantism. Every year, the distance between what England was becoming and what Mary believed grew wider. Her father Henry VIII died in January 1547. He was 55 years old, enormous, diseased, and had been married 6 times. He left behind 3 children: Edward, aged 9, Mary, aged 30, and Elizabeth, aged 13. Edward VI became king, guided by Protestant advisers who accelerated the religious changes Henry had begun. The Mass was abolished. Catholic priests were persecuted. The England that Mary had grown up in, the England of incense and Latin prayers and candlelight and the old rhythms of the Church, was being dismantled piece by piece. Mary refused to give up her private Mass. It was the one thing she would not surrender. For 6 years, she waited. Then Edward became seriously ill. He was 15, 16, young, brilliant, deeply Protestant, dying of what was probably tuberculosis. And as he lay dying, his advisers panicked. If Mary became queen, the Protestant Reformation in England would be undone. Everything they had built would be destroyed. They had to stop her. In the summer of 1553, Edward VI signed a document known as the Device for the Succession. It bypassed both Mary and Elizabeth entirely and placed the crown on the head of Lady Jane Grey, a 16-year-old girl, a Protestant, a pawn in someone else's game. Edward died on July 6, 1553. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen in London. Mary was in the countryside, warned just in time by a loyal messenger. She fled to East Anglia, where support for her was strongest, and she did something remarkable. She wrote to the Privy Council and declared herself the rightful Queen of England. What happened next surprised everyone. The people of England rose for Mary, not because they necessarily agreed with her Catholic faith, but because they believed in legitimate succession, because they had watched a 16-year-old girl be thrust onto the throne by powerful men who wanted to control her. Because Mary was Henry VIII's daughter, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, and the rightful heir. Within days, Mary's supporters numbered in the thousands. The Privy Council, realizing which way the wind was blowing, switched sides. Lady Jane Grey's father abandoned her. Her husband was arrested. On July 19th, 1553, just 13 days after Lady Jane Grey had been proclaimed Queen, Mary Tudor rode into London. The crowds were enormous. People wept. People threw their hats in the air. Bells rang across the city. A woman who had spent most of her adult life as an afterthought, as a problem, as someone to be managed and controlled and pressured into submission, was now Queen of England. She was the first woman to successfully claim the English throne. She was 37 years old. Mary's early reign showed a side of her that history has largely forgotten. She was merciful. Lady Jane Grey, the girl who had been placed on the throne against her will, was imprisoned but initially spared. Mary's advisers urged her to execute the young woman immediately. Mary refused for months. She was pragmatic. She kept many of her brother's Protestant advisers in place, at least initially. She moved carefully, methodically, trying to undo the religious changes of the previous 2 decades without triggering rebellion. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, personally kind. She remembered the names of servants. She was generous to the poor. She had a genuine sense of humor that appeared in private correspondence and surprised those who encountered it. But Mary was also a woman carrying 20 years of trauma, 20 years of humiliation, isolation, loss, and grief. 20 years of watching everything she loved stripped away one piece at a time, and she was determined to restore it all. In 1554, Mary made the decision that would define her reign and seal her reputation. She announced her intention to marry Philip of Spain, son of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, and heir to the Spanish throne. The reaction in England was immediate and hostile. The English did not want a Spanish king. Rebellions broke out. The most serious, led by a man named Thomas Wyatt, came close enough to London that Mary could hear the cannon fire from the Palace of Whitehall. She did not flee. She went to the Guildhall and gave a speech. It was one of the great speeches of the Tudor period, passionate, personal, and extraordinarily effective. She told the people of London that she loved them, as a mother loves her children. She told them that her marriage to Philip would be conducted on England's terms. She told them that she would never do anything to harm the country that was hers and theirs together. The crowd was moved. London held for Mary. Wyatt's rebellion collapsed. Its leaders were arrested, and Lady Jane Grey, who had had nothing to do with the rebellion, but whose existence made her a perpetual rallying point for Protestant dissent, was finally executed, not by Mary's wish, but by the logic of political necessity that Mary could no longer resist. Philip arrived in England in July 1554. The wedding took place at Winchester Cathedral. Mary was 38, Philip was 26. He was, by contemporary accounts, polite and correct in his behavior toward his wife, but not in love with her. This was a political marriage, and both of them knew it. Mary, however, fell in love with her husband. It was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of her story, that this woman who had known so little tenderness in her life finally gave her heart to a man who did not return her feelings, who spent most of their marriage abroad in his Spanish territories, and who visited England only when political necessity required it. In February 1555, the first Protestant martyr was burned at the stake in England. His name was John Rogers. He was a Bible translator, a scholar, a man who had spent his life working with words and ideas. He burned at Smithfield, in London, on a cold winter morning, while his wife and 11 children watched from the crowd. He was the first. He would not be the last. Over the next 3 years, nearly 300 people were burned for heresy in England. Bishops, priests, ordinary men and women, young and old, educated and illiterate. They came from every corner of the country. They died in town squares and open fields and marketplaces, in front of crowds that sometimes cheered and sometimes wept, and sometimes stood in a terrible, helpless silence. History would call this period the Marian persecutions. History would give Mary her name, Bloody Mary. But history rarely asks the question that matters most. Why? To understand the burnings, you have to understand what Mary believed, genuinely, deeply, at the core of her identity. Mary believed that the Protestant Reformation was not simply a political disagreement or a difference of opinion about theology. She believed it was a catastrophic error, a wound in the body of Christendom that was damning souls to hell. She believed that heresy, the deliberate rejection of Catholic doctrine, was the most serious crime a human being could commit because it endangered not just the body, but the immortal soul. In this belief, she was not unusual for her time. Burning heretics was standard practice across Catholic Europe. Her cousin, Philip of Spain, presided over an inquisition that burned people for the same reasons. The Protestant reformers in Geneva burned people too. The 16th century burned people. Mary burned people at a rate that was, by the standards of her time and place, not extraordinary. What made it extraordinary was the context. England had been Protestant for 20 years. The people burned were English, and the Queen doing the burning was a woman, which meant that every fire became, in the Protestant propaganda that poured from printing presses in exile, evidence of female weakness, female cruelty, female instability. John Foxe, a Protestant writer working in exile, compiled the stories of the martyrs into a book that would become one of the most widely read texts in English history. It was vivid, detailed, devastating, and extraordinarily effective. It fixed the image of Bloody Mary into the English Protestant imagination so deeply that it has never been dislodged. But Foxe was writing propaganda. He was not writing history. The truth of Mary is more complicated, more human, more sad. In the autumn of 1554, Mary announced that she was pregnant. The joy at court was genuine and enormous. A Catholic heir would secure the succession, would make everything Mary was trying to build permanent. Philip was attentive, present, almost warm. Mary herself seemed transformed, healthier, happier, more certain of her purpose than she had been in years. The months passed. The birth did not come. Doctors waited. Ladies in waiting waited. The court waited. The country waited. Nothing. By the summer of 1555, it became impossible to deny any longer. There was no baby. There had never been a baby. Whether Mary had suffered a miscarriage that was never officially acknowledged, or whether she had experienced a false pregnancy, a condition in which the body mimics the symptoms of pregnancy due to intense psychological desire. No one knows for certain. What is certain is the devastation. Mary had wanted this child more than she had wanted anything. More than the throne, perhaps. A child would have been proof that God approved of what she was doing. A child would have been the future she had been building toward. There was no child. Philip left England shortly after. He would return once more, briefly, in 1557, when he needed English support for his war against France. But the marriage, which had never been warm, grew cold. Mary wrote him letters that he answered with polite, formal distance. She waited for him to return. He did not return. She was alone again. She had always been alone. In January 1558, England lost Calais. Calais was the last English possession on the French mainland, a remnant of the medieval empire that English kings had once ruled across the Channel. It had been English for over 200 years. Its loss to a French army that moved faster than anyone anticipated was a humiliation that struck at the heart of English national pride. Mary bore the blame because Mary was the Queen, and queens bear the blame for what happens on their watch. It is said that she told her attendants, "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." Whether she actually said these words is uncertain, but they feel true. They feel like something she would have said, in that way she had of turning her grief into something almost unbearable in its honesty. By the summer of 1558, Mary was dying. She was 42 years old. She had suffered from what modern historians believe was uterine or ovarian cancer, possibly combined with influenza. She was in constant pain. She had lost weight. Her vision, never strong, had deteriorated badly. She announced a second pregnancy in early 1558. There was no second pregnancy. Through the summer and autumn, she continued to conduct the business of government from her sickbed, signing documents, receiving ambassadors, trying to manage a kingdom that was slipping away from her. In October and November 1558, an influenza epidemic swept through England. Mary caught it. She died on November 17th, 1558, at St. James's Palace in London, early in the morning. She had reigned for 5 years, 4 months, and 11 days. At her bedside, her ladies reported, she had been peaceful at the end. She had spoken of dreams, beautiful, comforting dreams, she said, of little children like angels playing around her. Perhaps in those last hours, she was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the throne and the fires and the failed pregnancies and the absent husband and the lost mother could not reach her. Perhaps she was a little girl again, in the palace of Placentia in Greenwich, with her parents young and golden and in love, and the whole world still full of possibility. Within hours of Mary's death, her half-sister Elizabeth was proclaimed Queen. England breathed out. The Protestant exiles began returning from the continent. The Catholic bishops who had presided over the burnings were arrested. The religious settlement that Elizabeth would construct over the following years would make England permanently Protestant. Mary's legacy was written by her enemies, as the legacies of the defeated so often are. The name Bloody Mary followed her through the centuries. But there are other things to remember. Mary was the first woman to successfully rule England in her own right. She proved that a woman could command armies, face rebellions, govern a kingdom. The precedent she set, simply by surviving and succeeding, made Elizabeth's reign possible. Without Mary, there is no Elizabeth. She reformed the Royal Navy. She reformed the coinage. She worked to reduce corruption in local government. She was, by the administrative standards of her time, a capable and conscientious monarch. She was also a woman who had been failed by almost everyone who should have protected her. Failed by a father who sacrificed her for his desires. Failed by a husband who married her for politics and left her for his other kingdoms. Failed by advisers who pushed her toward policies that would destroy her reputation. Failed by a body that could not give her the child she desperately wanted. She was human. Deeply, painfully, completely human. We remember the fires. We remember the name. But we should also remember the girl who played the lute at age 9 and made her father proud. The young woman who refused to renounce her mother, even when her own safety depended on it. The Queen who rode into London on a wave of popular support and became, for one brief moment, everything she had always believed she was meant to be. We should remember that she wept for the document she signed under duress, that she was merciful to Lady Jane Grey for as long as she possibly could be, that she loved a man who did not love her back and never stopped writing him letters. We should remember that when she died, she spoke of angels. History gave her a name dipped in blood. But the whole story, the full, complicated, human story, is so much more than a name. Mary I was a woman who suffered greatly, who caused great suffering, and who died believing that she had tried, against every obstacle, to do what was right. Whether she was right or wrong about what was right, that is a question history has been arguing about for nearly 5 centuries, and it may never be fully answered.